Rose had always been despised due to her mother's disparaging remarks. She had dedicated her entire existence to ensuring the stability of her family. In addition to ensuring her own well-being, she also assumed the role of the financial supporter, assuming all responsibilities when her parents and sibling were unable to do so. However, she left without a word when everything collapsed, and her sacrifices went unrecognized. What will be the outcome of this abrupt transformation in her life? Additionally, why did her family members respond in the manner they did upon her departure? The narrative of Rose, a woman who is unafraid to emerge from the confines of her family, is only beginning. However, will she genuinely achieve freedom and happiness, or will she encounter unforeseen tragedies that she could never have foreseen? Accompany us on this unpredictable and difficult expedition. Rose had recently reached the age of 30 and continued to reside with her parents. She had a straightforward aspiration after completing her university education, to become self-sufficient and establish an existence for herself. Nevertheless, the harsh reality of the world outside was far more severe than she had anticipated. With the faint hope and the barely there comfort of welfare payments, the days of unemployment stretched on endlessly. Rose then discovered a remote position, much like a ray of light penetrating through a dark tunnel. Leveraging her scientific expertise, she transitioned into freelance engineering. At first, the compensation was modest and the work was performed on a part-time basis. But Rose refused to surrender. She began to accumulate experience gradually, project by project. A year later, she discovered that she was earning the equivalent of a full-time office job. However, the return of her self-assurance was more valuable than the money. She was no longer the person she had been, as she was enveloped in self-doubt and uncertainty. Rose had constructed herself from the ground up. Nevertheless, Rose's mother was the only individual who never comprehended the situation. She was unable to comprehend Rose's occupation, and did not even attempt to do so. Despite the numerous contracts, client communications and income statements that Rose presented to her mother, she remained skeptical. "For how long are you planning to remain at home?" her mother would inquire. "Why don't you secure a legitimate position?" Rose's endeavors were of no consequence to her. She occasionally harbored suspicions that Rose was affiliated with a cult or engaged in illicit activities. Her words caused an unpleasant sensation. Rose had been working diligently, dedicating herself to her work day and night, and she was proud of her ability to provide for herself. She had entertained the possibility of relocating. However, she was unable to do so at that time due to financial constraints. Then, a critical juncture occurred. Her father contracted a severe illness and was compelled to retire. He assured her that she should not be concerned, as he still had his pension. However, Rose was acutely aware of her mother's reckless expenditures. She was unable to depart at this time. She could not abandon her father at a time when he required her the most. "There is no need for concern, father. I will ensure that all matters are addressed," Rose stated with assurance. Her father gazed at her with a mixture of bewilderment and emotion. "Are you certain that you can manage it?" Rose smiled as she presented her father with her bank account. "I am capable of doing it," she declared. Subsequently, Rose assumed responsibility for her father's medical expenditures and household expenses. She provided her mother with a supplementary credit card that was linked to her account and transferred money to him on a monthly basis. For the sake of the family's finances, her father and Rose requested that her mother engage in more parsimonious spending. Nevertheless, Rose's mother did not undergo any transformation. She persisted in her skepticism, even opining that Rose should relocate and establish a proper existence. Her father consistently supported her, endeavoring to persuade her mother to comprehend the situation. However, she preferred to remain silent. The temperature within the residence decreased. Her mother increasingly regarded her as a burden. Her mother would frequently reprimand her for failing to complete the household tasks in a timely manner. Rose endeavored to clarify that she was engaged in labor, as opposed to simply relaxing. However, her mother became incensed and refused to make an effort to comprehend the situation. With each passing day, the gap between them became increasingly pronounced. Rose's father was the sole individual who consistently provided her with motivation to persist. For 1 year they maintained this lifestyle, until her father's condition deteriorated to the extent that he required hospitalization. Rose visited him on a daily basis. She inquired, "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling today? I hope I am not a burden." "Thank you, Rose. I am not any better." Rose's eyes were ablaze with emotion as she declared, "You are never a burden. However, I am aware that my mother and I are no longer the same." The relationship between Rose and her mother was like a fragile filament, poised to break at any moment, following her father's hospitalization. Despite the difficulties she faced while living with her mother, Rose was resolute in her commitment to support both of her parents. Ultimately, they were her family. In a composed manner, she gazed at her brother. She concentrated on her task. Rose utilized her laptop during her visit to her father's hospital room. Her father expressed his dissatisfaction. Rose's mother entered the room with her arms crossed tightly over her bosom, and her gaze fixed on her daughter. "At present, you are using that as an excuse," she stated in a manner that caused Rose's sternum to tighten. "What is the rationale behind this justification?" Rose's pulse plummeted as she endeavored to maintain her breath. Her mother's words were always like a sharp slap, piercing through her meticulously constructed composure. Rose had been an outsider in her own home ever since Jack had returned. The atmosphere between them had become acrimonious, with unspoken resentments lingering in the air like a dense fog. "You have become increasingly distant since Jack returned home," her mother continued, her voice accusing, as if it were Rose's responsibility for the rift that was forming. "Are you currently employed? Or are you perpetually concealed in your bedroom, refusing to communicate with us?" Rose's exasperation intensified as she felt her pulse accelerate, but she endeavored to contain it. She had articulated her work, her circumstances, and her commitment to both her father and her independence on 1,000 occasions. What was the reason for their inability to comprehend? Nevertheless, her mother persisted in her relentless repetition of the same questions, as if Rose's every endeavor was irrelevant. "I was under the impression that I had effectively communicated that," Rose replied, her voice becoming more subdued than she had intended, but she maintained her composure in the face of her increasing aggravation. Jack, who was standing nearby, shook his head in a manner that indicated impatience, possibly even disdain. "You are being exceedingly challenging," he said, his words evoking the unmistakable tone of superiority that had always come so readily to him. "Mom is correct." The word's sting was more intense than any physical strike, and Rose could feel it. The constant implication that she was not doing enough, that her work was somehow less valuable than theirs, was evident in addition to Jack's harshness. The suggestion that she was in some way underperforming. Jack's voice penetrated the tension in the room as he stated, "If you are unwilling to make a meaningful contribution, it may be time to reconsider your decision to reside in this location." Once more, that term participate. A wave of frustration washed over Rose, suffocating her, and her chest tightened. She was unable to comprehend the extent of the cruelty. The years of financial support she had provided, the meals she had purchased, the bills she had paid, and the medical expenses she had discreetly borne, none of this seemed to matter. They perceived her as a burden, a failure who required constant reminders of her status. The weight of Rose's contributions failed to register in the mind of her mother, who stood silently. Her gaze momentarily shifted to her. Rose's thoughts were entangled in the hopelessness of it all, as her mind whirled. How were they able to remain unaware? How could they fail to acknowledge the work she had accomplished and the sacrifices she made to ensure their financial stability? The words she desired to express were lodged in her larynx, but they were too burdensome and perilous to articulate. She was perplexed by her mother's refusal to acknowledge the impact of Rose's efforts, as she stood with her arms crossed in judgment. The final wound, which was more profound and agonizing than any other, was the silence of her mother in response to her own sacrifices. The gap between them had become irreparable. The weight of the conversation pressed down on Rose's chest as she stood in the doorway, her gaze unwavering. The atmosphere was permeated with accusations and unspoken words, and the room was dense with tension. Jack and Sophia had been invited to the house without her knowledge, and they were now attempting to evict her, as if her presence, after all the sacrifices she had made, was no longer significant. Her mother, who was situated across from her, declined to even glance in her direction. The silence between them was oppressive, as if Rose's contributions to this family, every dollar she had spent, every expense she had paid, were insignificant. Sophia's lips curled into a smile that was just short of her eyes. "We are merely endeavoring to establish some order in this location," she stated, her tone betraying a hint of contempt. "It has been somewhat chaotic, has it not?" Rose's fists were clenched at her sides, but she endeavored to maintain a steady voice. "Sophia, I am currently employed," she announced, her demeanor characterized by an almost intolerable sense of tranquility. "I have been the sole provider for this household when no one else has. Additionally, I earn more than either of you likely realize." Jack scoffed, disregarding her words with a derisive snort. "Real work is not conducted online," he declared, his tone tinged with jest. Rose's blood chilled, but she refrained from permitting her wrath to dominate her. However, she took a deep breath and asked, her voice steady despite the surge of emotion bubbling beneath, "Is that your opinion, Jack? Then tell me who covered Dad's medical bills last month when the card was declined? Who paid the heating bill when no one else stepped up? Who set up Mom's supplementary credit card when Dad was no longer able to manage it?" A hush descended upon the chamber. The weight of her words lingered in the air. Unspoken truths that Jack and Sophia could not deny, but they also could not acknowledge. Rose maintained her composure, her heart beating rapidly. For years she had maintained this household, enduring ridicule and being disregarded as a failure. Despite this, she continued to advance, always with the expectation that one day, they would recognize her for who she truly was. However, today she experienced an internal conflict. She had exhausted herself by endeavoring to demonstrate her capabilities to those who were unwilling to comprehend her. Rose was unable to identify the emotion that caused her mother's visage to flutter. However, she refrained from speaking. No apology was issued, and Rose's contributions were not recognized. The only sound was the frigid, oppressive silence of a mother who had long since renounced the bond that should have existed. Rose continued, her voice now quieter but infused with a finality that both startled and emboldened her. "I have spoken to Dad," she said. "He has instructed me to pursue my own course of action. Consequently, I am departing." Jack's gaze altered, and he wore a smirk on his face, as if her departure were merely another inconvenience that he did not wish to address. His tone was tinged with cynicism as he inquired, "Where are you headed? What is the most likely destination for you?" Rose met his gaze with unwavering clarity. Her words were as pointed as a blade, cutting through the suffocating tension as she said, "Somewhere I can breathe." She stood on her heels, her back erect and her head held high. Their approbation was no longer a factor. It was no longer about her remaining within the boundaries of this home that had never been truly hers. In return, they had robbed her of her dignity, despite the fact that she had given them everything. She could hear her brother's voice, which was accusatory and strident as she passed them. He shouted, "I had to take a day off because of you," in an attempt to shift the responsibility onto her. His words were thinly veiled. Rose's irises narrowed as she halted in her tracks. She was unable to comprehend how he could be so irresponsible, so willing to discard his work for something so trivial. She inquired, her composed demeanor revealing a hint of incredulity. "You took a day off for that? You simply disregard your obligations without hesitation?" His irritation was evident as he and Sophia escalated their argument, as his voice rose. Rose now found the words they exchanged to be meaningless, nothing more than the din of a life she no longer desired to be a part of. Subsequently, Jack's directive struck her like a blow to the face. "Depart." Rose's voice was subdued yet firm as she inquired, "For what?" The hurt was simmering just beneath the surface. "What is the reason for my departure?" Jack's response was unwavering, his remarks authoritative. "We will all be cohabitating from this point forward." Rose's mother, who had been silent for an extended period, eventually spoke, her tone being markedly colder, as if she were dismissing her entirely. She stated, "That is sufficient," as if to conclude the conversation. "After your father's passing, You are no longer entitled to a residence here, Rose. The floor beneath Rose's boots vibrated. Her mother's words, which were so definitive and devoid of any acknowledgement of the life she had sacrificed to maintain the unity of the family, struck her like a crushing wave. Her existence, her sacrifices were all being obliterated in an instant. However, Rose was aware of the situation at that precise moment. Her mother had already determined that she was unnecessary, and that all of her actions were irrelevant. It was as though she had never been a member of this family, as if her presence were of no consequence. Rose's bosom was filled with the finality of the situation, and a bitter taste permeated her mouth. It was not the first time she had been overlooked, however, this time was unusual. She was now finished. Rose's wrath intensified as she observed her family, particularly her mother, brother, and sister-in-law, disregard her explanations, despite her numerous attempts to provide a more comprehensive account. Although she was aware that her mother had been spending excessively on luxurious items, she was unable to escape the concern regarding the potential repercussions of her mother's financial situation. Rose determined that it was time to take action, as she was no longer able to tolerate their indifference. She initiated the process by transferring funds from her mother's bank account, which was associated with her credit card, to an account that she had authority over. She intended for her mother to be taken aback when her credit card malfunctioned. Subsequently, Rose transferred a portion of the funds from her father's account, which had been previously utilized to support the family's expenses. The account will be exclusively utilized to cover her father's medical expenses from this point forward. This implied that the majority of the remaining expenses would be the responsibility of her brother and sister-in-law. She was certain that her brother would promptly experience the effects of this change. Rose informed her family of her departure, and packed her belongings once everything was in order. They were struck aback. They anticipated that she would endure their mistreatment and remain. Rather, she observed a peculiar sense of contentment in their faces, as if they were almost eagerly anticipating her departure. Jack hissed. "Are you finally departing? I have never observed you being so disruptive." Rose merely shook her head in response to her sister-in-law's mockery. "You're not coming back?" She replied with a frigid tone. "Certainly not. I have made my decision. Please refrain from contacting me in the future." As she exited the residence, Rose couldn't help but smile to herself, anxious to commence a new chapter. The location to which she was traveling was serene and placid, providing her with the opportunity to concentrate on her work without the interference of her family. Nevertheless, one day her phone rang. Her sibling was the individual in question. Rose responded with a composed tone that was tinged with annoyance. "I advised you not to contact me." Jack appeared to be in a state of agitation and bewilderment. "That is accurate. That is accurate." He was unable to speak immediately, and he paused. Rose waited with patience, but she could sense the tension building within her. She inquired, "Why did you not inform me earlier? What was the reason for your failure to notify me?" Rose reminded him, "I have mentioned it many times. I told you about my work, but you and Mom never believed me," to which he responded, "We didn't know." Jack attempted to shift the responsibility. "Well, my mother's excessive talk caused me to be perplexed." Rose inquired, her voice brimming with frustration. "So I'm not at fault, right?" "Exactly," Jack replied, but his demeanor was devoid of sincerity. Rose's rage erupted. She had provided for this family for an extended period of time, making significant sacrifices. However, she was met with derision and denial in lieu of appreciation. The wound her family had caused was only exacerbated by the words she spoke, as she was unable to contain her frustration. One afternoon, Rose's phone called, and the abrupt interruption of her brother's voice caused a wave of irritation to run through her. "As a consequence of my absence, you are now accountable for all financial obligations and matters. Rose, I require your assistance. Would you be able to transfer some funds to my account?" His voice, which is typically so assertive, now trembled with a hint of desperation. She was taken off guard. She reflected, "You are employed by a significant organization. Don't you believe you should be receiving a sufficient salary?" However, her voice was unremarkable as she inquired, "What transpired? Why?" The weight of his words pressed down on her, causing Jack's voice to subside. I was terminated from that organization. Her thoughts were in a state of agitation as she endeavored to comprehend the implications. What had gone awry? She was perplexed. What transpired? Why? She inquired, her tone becoming increasingly abrasive. I made a significant error, he acknowledged, his voice tinged with remorse. Rose found it difficult to digest. She had always been burdened by her family's financial obligations. However, it appeared that they were once more seeking her assistance. Rose then realized that Jack had returned to their parents' residence in the hopes that there would be sufficient resources to support him. It is possible that he was under the impression that their father's pension would cover all expenses, allowing him to unwind. She felt a bitter guffaw erupt within her. He was unaware of the activities she had been conducting in the background to maintain the stability of the situation for an extended period. She envisioned his expression of astonishment when he finally comprehended the full extent of her sacrifice. Sophie, Jack's wife, entered the conversation shortly thereafter, her voice taut with anxiety. We are in a precarious situation. Your father is extremely displeased and has stated that he will no longer provide assistance. Rose's response was unwavering, and it may have been slightly too strong. I have already provided him with sufficient assistance. You are breaking your heart. It is imperative that he prioritizes our needs. You will provide more support from afar. Jack's voice faltered, and a sense of dread began to permeate the conversation before he could conclude it. Please, Rose, be patient. Her patience had been depleted. Consider your words with care, he advised, her demeanor quickly. I am terminating this call at this time. Please refrain from contacting me in the future. He then terminated the conversation. He had reached a conclusion. There would be no further financial assistance, and there would be no further attempts to maintain the stability of the Jack's investment. It was time for her to thoroughly separate herself from the chaos that had become her family. The days that followed saw her father, who was fatigued and disillusioned by the constant strain of their home life, consult a lawyer and eventually relocate. Rose was relieved that he was no longer subjected to the relentless turmoil that her mother had cultivated. He had located a new residence in which he could reside with dignity, and Rose visited him on a daily basis, relishing their time together. She promptly received information regarding her brother's circumstances from a friend. Jack's new living arrangements were modest. He had relocated to a small apartment, which was a far cry from the luxury he had once anticipated. Her mother, who was acclimated to serving as the matriarch of the household, was experiencing difficulty in her new position. At the same time, Jack, who had been self-assured following his graduation, was struggling to navigate a part-time position in which he was collaborating with colleagues who were significantly younger. His employment was brief. Sophie was the primary source of income for a period, which enabled the small family to remain solvent. However, she ultimately withdrew from him due to the overwhelming burden. They were now responsible for the consequences of their decisions and actions. Rose's mother persisted in her financial irresponsibility, accumulating debt and indulging in unnecessary indulgences. Despite her continued concern for her, Rose was unable to take any further action. The well had dried up, and she had already contributed a significant amount. Presently, Rose resided in a modest, private residence. She was assiduously working, and her income was steadily increasing. She was preoccupied with the present and the life she was creating for herself. She visited her father on a daily basis, savoring each moment. She observed his smile and the happiness in his gaze as they spent time together, and she was certain that, in spite of all else, this was what truly mattered.